At 0147 hours local time, 14 Ukrainian AN-196 Lutia strike drones crossed into western Crimea at 60 meters above terrain and turned southeast toward a target that had been on the operational priority list longer than any other site on the peninsula. The drones flew a route that had been refined across 17 days of collection and 3 separate planning cycles, not because the target was newly identified, but because the target had been held back. Not for lack of value, for the opposite reason. The facility they were approaching was not a radar array. It was not a missile battery or a fuel depot or a bomber parking apron. It was the Crimean Air Defense Coordination Center, the site where radar data from every S-400, Book M3 and Nebo-M system across the peninsula converged, was processed by operations staff working in shifts around the clock, and was distributed back out as the shared targeting picture that gave every battery in Crimea more warning time, more confidence in its engagements, and more precision in its target assignments than any single system could achieve operating alone. It was also the site that had been conspicuously absent from the target list through the 9 previous strikes in this series, not because it hadn't been identified, and not because it wasn't considered valuable, but because striking a coordination center that is effectively defended is considerably harder than striking the individual systems it serves. Those systems are distributed across a wide geographic area and cannot all concentrate their defensive capability on a single point. A coordination center sits at a specific location, and if that location is known, it can be defended. It was defended, and the campaign that had been running for the preceding months had been slowly removing the components of that defense one by one, until tonight. If you have watched every video in this series and found yourself asking the same question after each one, why do these systems keep failing when they work correctly in theory? The facility ahead of 14 drones at 0147 hours is most of your answer. Not the whole answer, but most of it. Each AN-196 Lutius cost approximately $40,000. 14 of them together represented a total strike expenditure of $560,000. The coordination center they were approaching had never been struck in this campaign. It had been protected deliberately and at cost because of what it was worth to the network. It was being targeted now specifically because that protection had been progressively degraded across a series of strikes that had removed key elements of the outer defensive layer one by one, until the protection remaining was thin enough that 14 drones with a specific approach profile could reach the facility before the network it served could mount a response sufficient to stop them. Every air defense system in this series operated with some version of the same capability, a radar that detected inbound threats and a missile or gun system that engaged them. What varied across each engagement was not the systems themselves, but how much time they had before the threat arrived, how confidently they could distinguish real threats from background clutter, and how clearly they understood which contacts to prioritize when multiple threats appeared simultaneously. In every case where a system performed well, it had adequate warning time and a clean target picture. In every case where it failed, one or both of those conditions had been compromised. The Crimean Air Defense Coordination Center was the facility that produced both conditions for every system on the peninsula when it was functioning. Long-range Nebo-M surveillance radars covering the western approaches to Crimea fed their raw detection data into the center in real time. The center's operators processed that data, filtered noise, confirmed tracks, and assigned confidence levels to contacts before distributing them to the relevant battery fire control systems. An S-400 battery in the Olyanka area receiving a targeting cue from the coordination center was not working from its own radar picture alone. It was working from a picture assembled from multiple radar systems covering overlapping sectors, with the noise reduced and the track confidence elevated by the processing that happened in the center between detection and distribution. The practical effect of this was measurable in minutes. An S-400 crew receiving a coordination center cue on an inbound contact at 80 kilometers had more time to build a firing solution and execute an engagement than the same crew working from its own 91N6E radar, which typically acquired the same contact at a shorter range due to terrain masking, sea surface clutter, and the geometric limits of a ground-based sensor at a fixed elevation. Those extra minutes were not theoretical. They were the difference between engaging a threat at maximum effectiveness and engaging it in compressed time at a reduced confidence level. There was a second function the coordination center performed that was arguably more valuable than the warning time extension and which received less attention in most coverage of how Russian air defense networks operate. That function was deconfliction. When multiple batteries across a 50-kilometer sector all receive contact data from a shared picture, they can see which contacts are already being serviced by another battery and which are not, allowing them to avoid firing multiple missiles at the same target while leaving other contacts unengaged. Without a shared picture, each battery makes its own engagement decisions based on its own radar, which means batteries in overlapping coverage areas may engage the same contact simultaneously, wasting 2 missiles on one target, while a contact in the gap between their individual radar coverages goes unengaged because neither radar sees it clearly enough to commit. Deconfliction is an invisible function when it is working. Its absence shows up as both wasted missiles and targets that slip through in the spaces between batteries' individual coverages. Every battery in Crimea was more effective because this facility was operating. Every battery was less effective when it was not. This is the question this script is the answer to. Not what did each individual strike accomplish. Those answers were covered in the 8 chapters of each of the 9 videos preceding this one. The question is structural. Why did the cumulative effect of 9 strikes against separate, individually capable systems add up to a Crimean air defense posture that could be penetrated by 14 drones on the night described in this video, when each of those 9 previous strikes had targeted a system that appeared individually to have been degraded or destroyed without fundamentally breaking the network around it? The answer requires understanding that the network's capability was never located in any one of those individual systems alone. It was located in the connections between them, in the shared picture that allowed each system to perform beyond what it could achieve independently. Each strike removed one system. Each removal made the shared picture less complete. The 10th strike targeted the picture. The Nebo-M early warning radar station was struck in a separate operation. Its loss meant that the coordination center received degraded long-range detection data from the western approach sector, the exact approach corridor the 14 drones were using. The center compensated as best it could with data from surviving sensors, but the western approach corridor had a coverage gap that had not existed before that radar was taken offline. The S-400 battery that was destroyed during a redeployment transit was the long-range intercept system that would have been the first line of engagement against threats approaching at medium altitude from the west. Its loss meant the coordination center could distribute a targeting queue on the inbound formation, but had no S-400 battery in range to execute the long-range intercept the queue called for. Queuing a battery that is no longer there achieves nothing operationally. The electronic warfare station destroyed in an earlier strike had been providing the jamming coverage that degraded satellite navigation signals for inbound drones across the western approach corridor. Its loss meant that drones using satellite guidance could now operate in that corridor without the navigation disruption they would have previously encountered. The 14 Luteus drones did not depend entirely on satellite navigation, but the jamming station's absence removed a source of degradation that had slowed or diverted prior drone formations in the same area. Each of those strikes was a separate operation targeting a separate system. None of them attacked the coordination center. All of them reduced the coordination center's ability to perform its function. The first by reducing the quality of data flowing in, the second by eliminating a system that should have acted on data flowing out, the third by removing a defensive layer that operated in parallel with the coordination process rather than within it. The pattern that emerges when these strikes are viewed as a sequence rather than as individual events is a campaign that had been shaped around a specific understanding of the Crimean air defense network as a system of interdependent parts rather than a collection of standalone assets. A campaign that targets standalone assets destroys whichever asset it reaches and leaves the rest intact. A campaign that targets the interdependencies between assets can degrade every component of a network simultaneously without destroying most of them, by removing the shared picture that made each component more effective than it could be alone, and by doing so through strikes on the surrounding layer rather than on the center itself. The coordination center was not struck early in this sequence because striking it early would have been the most obvious move, and the most obvious target in any network is invariably the most heavily defended one. It was struck last, the 10th operation, because by the time the surrounding layer had been sufficiently degraded, The defense protecting it was thin enough to reach with 14 drones and an approach profile built from 17 days of dedicated collection. The coordination center was not struck directly. It was progressively hollowed out from the outside until the center's own defense could no longer compensate for everything that had been removed around it. At 0221 hours, the S-400 battery covering the western approach to the coordination center acquired the leading elements of the AN-196 formation at 31 kilometers. The acquisition came from the battery's own 91N6E radar rather than from a coordination center queue. The western approach corridor gap left by the degraded Nebo-M coverage meant that the shared picture had no data on this contact at its normal queuing range. The 91N6E detected it later at a shorter range, and without the multi-source track confidence that a coordination center distribution would have carried. The crew responded correctly to what their radar showed. 39M96E2 missiles launched at 0224 hours, engaging the lead elements of the high group. 2 hits, 1 miss. 7 high group contacts continued south, and the S-400 prepared its second salvo. The specific operational effect of the degraded coordination picture was visible in the second salvo in a way that the numbers alone do not fully capture. A coordination center queue carries information about contacts that the battery's own radar cannot see. Contacts below the radar horizon, contacts masked by terrain, contacts whose track history from the previous 10 minutes of approach allows a more precise prediction of their current position and intended flight path. That track history is what allows a fire control system to predict where a target will be when a missile reaches the intercept point with high confidence, rather than where it was when the firing solution was calculated. The difference in intercept probability between a high-confidence track history and a track that has only been visible for 30 seconds is significant against maneuvering targets at medium range. Without that supplementary data, the S-400's fire control was working from a picture accurate for the contacts it could see and blind to the contacts it couldn't. The low group of 6 AN-196 Luteus drones had been at 60 meters above terrain throughout the approach, below the S-400's reliable acquisition horizon from its current position. The coordination center at full capability would have had Nebo-M low-altitude search data on these contacts from further out and would have been distributing their track positions to the battery continuously. Tonight, those contacts did not appear on any shared picture because the Nebo-M coverage gap had never been restored after the earlier strike on the western approach radar. The S-400 fired its second salvo against 2 more high-group contacts. Both were destroyed. 5 high-group contacts and 6 low-group contacts continued toward the facility. The battery had 8 missiles remaining and no track data on half the formation. A Krasuka 4 electronic warfare complex positioned at the coordination center's outer perimeter had been running continuous GPS jamming coverage across the western approach corridor since 0200 hours, following an alert from the regional air defense network that drone activity had been detected in the frontier zone. The Krasuka 4's jamming output was genuine and effective within its designed coverage radius. Satellite navigation signals in the affected zone were disrupted at levels that would degrade the approach precision of any drone relying on GPS as its primary guidance. Of the 14 AN-196 Luteus drones in the formation, none were relying on GPS as their primary guidance at this point. All 14 had switched to inertial navigation and terminal phase scene matching at 30 kilometers out. A threshold built into the mission profile specifically because the Crimean electronic warfare environment had been well documented across previous operations, and the drone's terminal guidance had been designed to operate independently of satellite signals inside that range. The Krasuka 4's jamming was operating at full power against an approach profile that had already dispensed with the signal it was designed to disrupt. This dynamic, an electronic warfare system producing its designed output against a threat that had already adapted around it, had appeared in different forms across multiple previous engagements in this series. It is not a failure of the jamming system. The Krasuka 4 was doing exactly what it was built to do. It is a structural consequence of the gap between when a weapon system was designed and when a specific adversary's countermeasure crossed the threshold of practical deployment at scale. That gap tends to close faster in active conflict than in peacetime, because active conflict provides continuous real-world feedback on what is and is not working. feedback that compressed development cycles can act on in months rather than the years that peacetime acquisition programs typically require. The electronic warfare coverage that had successfully disrupted earlier, less sophisticated drone approaches to Crimean targets had been documented, analysed, and incorporated into the design of subsequent drone generations as a known problem to engineer around. The result was a capability specifically shaped by what the adversary's defences looked like, arriving against those defences after they had already been configured to handle an earlier capability they had already defeated. The jamming station's output was real. Its operational effect against this specific formation on this specific night was negligible, because the drones in the formation had been built after the lesson of what Crimean electronic warfare coverage looked like had already been incorporated into their guidance architecture. The Pantsir S1 battery at the Coordination Centre's inner perimeter had received the S-400's contact reports and was at full combat readiness as the surviving formation approached. What it did not have, and what its engagement performance would reflect, was the shared tracking picture that the Coordination Centre itself would normally have been generating and distributing to it. The Coordination Centre was the target tonight, not the source of defensive data. The operations staff inside it had shifted to emergency defensive protocols rather than network management when the outer engagement began, and the real-time distribution of the shared air picture had been suspended while the facility prepared to defend itself. A Pantsir S1 defending a facility without a shared picture is a Pantsir S1 working from its own shorter-range radar against whatever it can detect at the ranges its own sensors cover. Against 14 contacts approaching from 2 bearings, with no supplementary track data on the low group that had not appeared on any sensor until it was less than 8 kilometers away, the battery's engagement began later than it would have from a Coordination Center queue and without the positional confidence that a multi-source track history provided. 257 E-6 missiles fired at the first high group contacts to cross 4 kilometers. 1 hit, 1 miss. 3 more fired at the low group contacts as they emerged from below. The sensor horizon at 6 kilometers, 2 hits, 1 miss, 4 contacts destroyed. 7 remaining inside 3 kilometers, approaching from bearings that split the Pantsir S1's effective coverage arc. Here is where the absence of the shared picture compounded in a specific and measurable way. In a fully networked engagement, the Pantsir S1 would have been receiving the Coordination Centre's track distribution continuously, allowing it to know not just that there were contacts approaching from 2 bearings, but precisely how many, at what separation, and which of them were being addressed by other systems and which were not. That information allows a fire control crew to sequence its engagement decisions with full awareness of what is and is not already being handled elsewhere. Without it, the crew is making sequencing decisions based on its own radar picture, which shows contacts in its own coverage arc but tells it nothing about what is happening in the coverage arcs of the batteries around it. The decision to engage one contact rather than another is made without knowledge of whether a neighbouring battery is handling the alternative, which means either duplicate engagement or an unengaged gap, with no way to know which error is being made in real time. The fire control radar rotated between sectors at a rate that compressed each individual engagement solution against simultaneously approaching contacts. 4 more missiles, 2 more kills, 5 contacts reached the Coordination Centre's outer compound. The Pantsir S1 continued firing with whatever remained in its ready load, achieving 2 more intercepts against targets that were already past the outer wall. 3 contacts reached the facility's antenna cluster, communications vehicles, and command operations building. At 0237 hours, the first AN-196 Luteus detonated against the Coordination Centre's primary antenna array. The installation through which processed tracking data from across the Crimean radar network was transmitted to the batteries and interceptor systems it served. The antenna was not a single dish. It was a cluster of directional antennas, data link transmitters, and encrypted communications infrastructure that collectively provided the broadcast capability the center relied on to distribute its shared picture. A direct warhead detonation against the array's central mounting structure brought down the most critical components in the first impact and severed the facility's primary communications output in the seconds immediately following. The second drone struck the operations building at 0237 hours and 31 seconds. The building where the duty staff had been compiling, processing, and distributing the shared air picture was not hardened to the standard of an underground bunker. It was a hardened above-ground structure adequate for protection against small arms fire and fragmentation at distance. It was not adequate against a direct warhead detonation. The blast tore through the operations wing and destroyed the processing stations, display systems and communication terminals where the duty staff had been working seconds before the impact. All duty personnel had been evacuated to the facility's blast shelter after the outer engagement began. The correct protocol and the reason there were no personnel casualties. The equipment that had been giving Crimea's air defense its shared picture was gone. The people who operated it were unhurt in a blast shelter that had been built for exactly this scenario. There is a specific irony in the personnel outcome worth dwelling on briefly. The duty staff sheltering in the blast room were the people with the most current knowledge of the Crimean air defense picture, where every battery was positioned, which radars were degraded from prior strikes, which sectors had coverage gaps that hadn't been formally reported yet. That knowledge was intact and completely inaccessible to the network for the duration of their shelter protocol and for however long it would take to restore any communications capability afterward. Expertise survived in a shelter while the infrastructure for applying it burned outside. The third contact struck the backup communications vehicle parked at the facility's rear, the redundant system that existed specifically so the network could continue operating if the primary facility was damaged. The backup vehicle detonated in a secondary explosion from its power generation equipment, removing the one asset that might have partially maintained the center's function from a hardened position. 11 batteries, radars, and interceptor systems across Crimea continued operating exactly as they had before this strike. Every radar was still spinning, every missile was still loaded, every crew was still at their station. What was gone was the processed shared picture that had tied them into a network with capabilities greater than the sum of its parts. What remained was 11 separate systems, each seeing its own slice of the airspace, each operating without knowledge of what the others were tracking, each making engagement decisions without the deconfliction that had been preventing them from wasting missiles on contacts already serviced by another battery. The network did not go offline. It went deaf and mute simultaneously, still operational in every physical component, unable to function as a whole. The question that began this video, why do the systems in this series keep failing when they work correctly in theory, has a specific technical answer that this strike makes visible in a way no single previous video could. The S-400 is a genuine, capable system. The Book M3 is a genuine, capable system. The Pantsir S-1 crews in this series have consistently performed at or above their system's theoretical engagement parameters. None of those facts are in dispute. They all failed to stop the strikes covered in this series, not because they were inadequate systems operated by inadequate crews, but because the conditions under which they were being asked to perform had been progressively removed from the conditions those systems were designed to operate under. An S-400 designed to operate with long-range queuing from a shared radar network is a different system in practice from an S-400 operating from its own organic radar alone. The missile is the same, the launcher is the same, the crew training is the same. The effective range at which it can reliably engage a real threat with the warning time and track confidence to execute a high-probability intercept is meaningfully shorter when it is operating without the shared picture. That difference between the system's designed capability and its effective capability under degraded coordination is not visible in any equipment specification. It only becomes visible in the engagement records of a campaign like this one, where the coordination has been systematically eroded before anyone tried to count the individual system failures that resulted from it. Russia can in principle rebuild the Crimean Air Defense Coordination Center. It can restore the antenna array, replace the processing equipment, and return the operations staff to a rebuilt facility with a new shared picture. The timeline for that restoration is not days, it is weeks at the optimistic end, and more likely months if the spare processing and communications equipment has to be sourced and transported in a wartime logistics environment that is already under strain from demands across multiple sectors. The reconstruction also requires making a decision about whether to rebuild at the same location, which is now a known target with a documented approach profile, or to establish the center at a new location, which requires site preparation, infrastructure installation, and the technical integration work that connects a new facility to the existing battery and radar network around it. Neither option is quick, and neither option is simple. The reconstruction timeline also interacts with another constraint that does not appear in any equipment specification: the institutional knowledge held by the operations staff who have been running the center's data processing and deconfliction functions. Military organizations do not document their tacit knowledge efficiently, and a duty crew that has been managing the Crimean air defense picture continuously for months develops an understanding of the network's behavior, its recurring failure modes, and its sensor coverage quirks that cannot be fully transferred to a replacement crew through formal documentation in the time available before restoration operations begin. Every day of reconstruction is a day spent not only restoring hardware but rebuilding the human operating picture that made the hardware effective. 5. $160,000 to take down the system that explained everything that happened in the previous 9 videos in this series. That is not the final number, and the story does not end with one facility restored or one network temporarily blinded. But if there is one strike in this campaign that changed more than what it physically destroyed, that created a gap not in one system, not in one battery's defensive coverage, but in the shared awareness that made all the other systems worth what Russia paid for them. This is the one to understand, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the strike that makes every previous engagement in this series coherent as a single campaign rather than a set of isolated incidents. Thank you for watching until the end of this video, and for watching this entire series. Thank you for watching until the end of this video, and for watching this entire series. Drop a comment with the engagement from this series that surprised you most. Subscribe to the channel if you want to understand why Crimea's air defense keeps failing under this kind of pressure. And thank you for supporting this channel.